Our ancestors evolved in Africa. 1.5 million years ago, they'd reached a stage we call Homo erectus. I am sure these people had dark skins. That pigment was essential to protect the naked body from the tropical sun. I think that they had lost most of their body hair, an adaptation that allowed them to keep cool through efficient sweat evaporation, crucial to a large two-legged primate if it's to survive on the open savanna. Apart from their protruding brow ridges, large protruding face, and their smaller brain, they were essentially like modern people. Before 1.5 million years ago, we find no direct human ancestors at all outside Africa. But with these people, a process began which eventually led to the occupation of the whole world. We shouldn't think of this process as a deliberate out of Africa. Indeed, large human populations remained here. Yet small groups slowly moving to new hunting areas could, at only 15 miles a generation, reach Europe in 5,000 years, Asia in 10,000. At first, the country they moved through would be familiar enough. The vast savannas of tropical Africa, with abundant year-round game, was where our ancestors had lived successfully for more than 2 million years. But as they began to move north into the more temperate world, they faced new problems. The cold, the lack of sunlight, the changing seasons, and the scarcity of vegetable food in winter. They had to adapt to meet these challenges or move back into the tropics. And they were successful. Less than 500,000 years after they evolved in Africa, we find them firmly established 6,000 miles away in China. This amazing wall was built by the Chinese some 2,000 years ago, and at that time people had already been living in China for close to 1 million years. What is particularly interesting is that today the modern Chinese look back and claim a direct ancestry from those people who lived here hundreds of thousands of years ago. I came here to film in China because I want to show you some of the very important finds of Homo erectus that have been made here in China, the first good evidence of Homo erectus outside of Africa. This is the village of Chukujian. It's about 30 miles southwest of the capital of China, Peking. On the surface, it's just an ordinary village, like thousands of others in China. Yet for prehistorians like myself, this is a very special place because of the discoveries made near here over the last half-century. Chukujian is a center of the limestone industry, and on the outskirts of the village is what was once one of the most important of the limestone quarries. By the early 20s, this quarry was abandoned, but it was to become important again for something quite different. From 1921 onwards, prehistorians came here to look for what the local people called dragon bones. The villagers had found many bones and teeth in the abandoned quarry. These were highly prized by the Chinese, who believed they had medicinal qualities. These dragon bones were in fact fossils. Some of the earliest expeditions to look for these fossils included a Canadian scientist, Dr. Davidson Black, and a number of Chinese prehistorians from Peking. Dr. Black's son kept the unique film taken by his father on those early expeditions, which were to produce some of the most famous finds of prehistory. From the start, the quarry of Stone Hill looked promising. A few fossilized teeth turned up. Then, among the limestone rock, they found numerous fragments of broken quartz, soon recognized as early stone tools. The scientists became convinced that it would only be a matter of time before they found the maker of the tools. Yet they found only fragments, more teeth, small pieces of skull, part of a jawbone. By late 1929, they had excavated deep into the quarry and had broken through the roof of what had once been a huge cave. On December the 12th, as it was getting dark, the group's leader, Professor Pei, was called down to look at something they had found inside the cave.
On
the side wall of the cave, there was a little hole. We dug into it and saw a round inside the hole. We brushed away the dirt to have a closer look. I said that it was a human skull. I thought it over. I felt that it was risky to leave it there in case someone came along at night and moved it. So I said that we should dig it up. So I used a long metal stick to dig, loosened the earth around it, and then dug it up.
Professor Pei carried the bone on a bicycle to Black's laboratory in Peking, 30 miles away. There the pieces were reassembled into an almost complete skull. They had indeed found the maker of the tools, who had lived at Chukuchien some 600,000 years ago. This was Peking Man. At the time this specimen was discovered, very little was known about our immediate ancestors. Indeed, so little was known that some people seriously doubted whether this specimen represented a true ancestor of man. Looking back at it now, and in the knowledge of various other specimens that have been found, it's quite clear that this was a direct ancestor of ourselves, a typical classic Homo erectus. The brain was slightly smaller. It has these prominent brow ridges that project out forwards. It also has this wasting behind the eyes, this narrowing down, if you like. And at the back of the skull, it's a very sharp angle. But apart from those differences, which are probably somewhat superficial, they are remarkably similar to the skulls of modern men. At this site, there have been a total of just over 40 individuals, represented by complete skulls, fragments of lower jaw, isolated teeth, and fragments of limb bones. This skull, like most other specimens of Homo erectus from Chokuchen, is represented by a cast, and the reason we only have casts is that the originals were lost. The fact that they're lost is one of the greatest tragedies in prehistory. The story of their loss is a story that has been told in many parts of the world, and is a story that still attracts considerable attention. During the Second World War, when Japan invaded China, those people concerned with fossils in China were concerned for the safety of these specimens. And with the best intentions in the world, they carefully packed up the fossils, not only of the early humans, but also other fossils, put them in packing cases, and proposed to send them out of Peking. Were they to be sent overseas, or were they to be sent somewhere else in China? We're not really sure. The popular story is that they were to be sent overseas, perhaps back to the United States. They were to be sent under the guard of the American Marines. The last time the packing cases containing the fossils were seen was on the dockside, but after that there is no clue. Various stories have emerged, various people have looked, but so far all of the originals are totally missing. Fortunately, the casts are very good, and a great deal can be learnt from these casts. One of the questions they help us answer is whether Peking man was more advanced than its African predecessors. We used to think that the brain had got bigger. Yet although the largest specimen from Chukutien has a brain about 3/4 the size of ours, there are others from the same site which are smaller. If you compare the whole range of skulls from Chukutien to the erectus skulls of 1 million years earlier from Africa, like this one from Kenya, you find that their sizes overlap. So, for 1 million years, our ancestors' brains don't seem to have increased much in size. It was a long period of evolutionary stability. Yet Peking man does differ slightly from earlier erectus fossils. It was thought that the shape of the cheek and nasal bones was specifically Mongolian, making Peking man a direct Chinese ancestor. We now know, however, that rather than being found only in China, they're present in many other erectus populations. Nevertheless, there will certainly be certain characteristics that are only found in this part of the world. And indeed, there are some examples, such as the incisor teeth of Homo erectus from China, that are very characteristic. The central incisor is characterized by being shovel-shaped. That is, the back of the tooth has been hollowed out, sort of concave. And indeed, the central incisor of modern Chinese people living here is similarly hollowed out. And this feature is not seen in many other human populations around the world. And so it seems to be a non-functional characteristic seen in this particular population that carries through time. In general terms, I don't think there's any doubt that the Homo erectus in China gave rise to later populations of Homo sapiens in this same part of the world. Similarly, the people that moved across the Bering Strait to the New World surely can trace their origins back to China. Like modern Chinese people, Peking man almost certainly had a paler skin than its African cousins. Dark skin inhibits the synthesis of vitamin D. This isn't a problem in the tropics, where there's a lot of sun, but in less sunny climates, to get enough vitamin D, paler skins must have been selected for. Despite these differences, I don't think any of the fossils found here can be used to prove that the present races of mankind divided over 500,000 years ago. In my view, modern races only emerged within the last 40,000 years. The fossils at Chukutien must represent simply a regional variation of Homo erectus. Yet there's more than just fossils here. Chukutien gives us an insight into the way Peking man thought and behaved. It provides a picture of the way of life of our distant ancestors. I'm now in the bottom of the Peking man site. Today it's nothing more than a very deep hole, about 40 meters or 120 feet. The oldest part of the cave is obviously at the base here, which is about 600,000 years. And as you go up through the various levels, it gets younger and younger, right up to the top, which is less than 200,000 years. And what we have is a slice through time. Besides the animal and human fossils and the artifacts, archaeologists working here in the 1930s found something that had never been found before and has never been found since in a site of this age. What they found was this thin layer of ash and charcoal right at the bottom of the cave. We now know that this ash and charcoal is probably the earliest evidence ever to have been found of domestic fire. It goes back almost 600,000 years. A lot of people have asked, how do we know that this fire, if it was fire, was man-made? Well, fire couldn't get into a cave by natural means. This is right inside, deep inside, a large cave system, and it could only have got here if it had been made by man. Within the cave, there are in fact several different levels of ash, and there's no doubt at all that man had learned to harness fire. Early man must have been familiar with bush and forest fires, started perhaps as the result of lightning strikes. To our very early ancestors, fire was a threat and a danger, as it is to all animals. At some point, they overcame their fear. They captured fire and used it to their advantage. This was a major turning point. But the obvious advantage of fire, that it keeps you warm, does not seem to have been the reason for its use here at Chukutien. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the climate wasn't that cold, and in probability it was used for other reasons. There are many fossils of dangerous animals. There are tigers such as this. A large number of skulls have been found. These animals were probably very dangerous to the people who lived here, and a fire would have served as some form of protection in the cave. In addition to protection, the fire probably was used for cooking. There are countless bones, such as this, that show definite evidence of having been burned. Presumably, meat was cooked on the fire, and this is the result. But in addition to protection and cooking, fire could also have been used for making various artifacts out of wood. Very often, if you take wood and you heat it over the fire, it becomes very hard, which would be ideal for making spear points or arrow points or things of that kind. Of course, fire has more than these purely practical uses. As night fell, it would surely acquire a deeper significance for our ancestors, just as it does for hunter-gatherer peoples today. For them, the campfire is somewhere to gather for conversation and companionship, a symbol of home. It serves as a focal point for the stories and songs of the tribe. It helps bind the group together. For dreams, for ritual, and for ceremony. Were such things important to Peking man? There is one strange clue from around the campfires at Chukutien. Most of the human skulls, like this one, have their base broken away. The skull is particularly weak in this area, so this could be due to natural breakage. But it's also been suggested that the skulls were deliberately and carefully broken open in order to extract the brain to eat it. This, it's suggested, is the evidence that Peking man was a cannibal. Let us imagine that these Homo erectuses were eating the brains of their fellows. Does this necessarily mean that they were nasty, brutish, and savage? I think it may mean quite the opposite. It's quite possible that if Homo erectus was eating the fellow human, it was merely an attempt to encompass within him or herself the brain power or the spirit of a fellow. Wherever you find cannibalism today, there's usually some ritualistic aspect to it. It's not necessarily just a means of getting extra protein to eat. This is the traditional view of cannibalism. The cooking pot, the butchered limbs, and the foreigners from across the sea ending up on the menu of primitive savages. But studies of many tribes have shown that eating human remains is always associated with ritual and is usually a sign of respect for the dead. These are the Yanomamo people from South America. They're acting out the rites of death. A child has died, and an elaborate ceremony is performed prior to the eating of the child's remains. The bones are burnt and pounded together into a fine powder. Some of the ashes are kept, but some will be used later to make a soup, which the whole group will then drink. The Yanomamo believe that in this way the child's spirit will be released and given sanctuary among the souls of those who remain. It's clear this is an act of reverence, and whether it's the eating of human flesh or human bones, we should always remember that this act can be the mark of a spiritual mind rather than simply a savage one. Is it possible that Homo erectus was also ritualizing his fellow dead? It's perfectly possible that this is the case. If it was the case, then I don't think there's any doubt that Homo erectus had by then reached a very important threshold and was now doing something that no other animal does. Homo erectus must have had a sense of self-awareness. So we shouldn't think of erectus as a brutish caveman. Indeed, as a discovery made here on the Mediterranean coast shows, it's likely that most of the time they didn't live in caves at all. This is the French resort of Nice. 400,000 years ago, the Mediterranean was about 85 feet higher than it is today. The old shoreline would have been about halfway up this hill that today slopes down to the harbour. Where there are now houses, there was a gentle tree-covered slope leading to a sandy beach. And where these flats are was found the evidence that Homo erectus had also visited this very spot. That evidence turned up when the flats were being built in 1965. Ancient stone tools were unearthed and construction was halted so that archaeologists could investigate. The archaeological team was given just 5 months to excavate before the building work had to begin again. The leader was Henry de Lumley, then an assistant professor of archaeology at Marseille University. And his team unearthed thousands of stone tools and animal bones that had been abandoned on the ancient beach. Everything they found on the beach was photographed, recorded and removed, and a plaster cast was then made of the beach itself. And then the builders finally moved in. They constructed the present-day flats of Terra Amata directly over the site of that ancient beach. However, the contractors were persuaded by Henry de Lumley to give up the whole of the ground floor for a museum, a monument to one of the earliest known campsites in Europe.
Here
in the Museum of Terra Amata, on the exact spot where a group of elephant hunters lived 400,000 years ago, we've placed a cast of their living floor.
This represents a section of that beach, as it must have looked when our ancestors left it. The most intriguing finds were these holes surrounded by small rocks. The archaeologists decided that these were post holes where branches had been pushed into the sand to form the framework of a hut. We asked some of de Lumley's team to reconstruct one of these huts. They found that to fit the pattern of the post holes they had discovered, only one kind of structure would work. It was oval in shape, with the branches interwoven tightly at the top. They are reconstructing one of Europe's earliest known buildings. In all, 20 shelters were discovered here, built perhaps over a relatively short period. This was a spot to which our ancestors returned regularly. There was nothing to tell the archaeologists for certain what Homo erectus had used to cover the hut, but there was one clue that allowed them to speculate. Inside the hut they found the remains of a fire, and the fact that the hunters had built a small wall of rocks and sand to protect the fire suggested that it must have been fairly drafty inside, so the hut was probably covered by nothing more substantial than branches. What else can we learn from this? Well, you can't build even something this simple without planning, without cooperation and some means of communication. And the fact that the hunters returned here each year to stay for a few months implies some degree of social organization in the group. This picture of increasing sophistication is supported by the other evidence they left behind. There are different types of stone tools: points for boring, scrapers for cleaning hides or skins, choppers for cutting meat and detaching limb bones. There's a pattern of increasing variation, different tools for different tasks. They also seem to have specialized in hunting certain types of animals, particularly the wild boar and the elephant. Not easy animals to hunt and kill. And to complete the picture, there's one piece of evidence that tells us at exactly what time of year these hunters came here.
But above all, we have found coprolite, that is, fossil excrement, containing pollens of plants which flower at the beginning of summer. So we can be certain that the Terra Amata hut was built around 400,000 years ago, towards the end of June.
Like the people of Chukutien, the hunters who built their shelters here were clearly successful. They had developed the skills necessary to master the temperate world beyond Africa. Around 400,000 years ago, Erectus is still living in Africa, but now they are also found along the southern shores of the Mediterranean and at various sites in Europe. There have been important finds of Erectus in the Middle East, across Asia, not only in China, but also in Java. From these widespread populations that the more modern humans were to emerge. When early populations of the genus Homo and later Homo erectus faced difficult environmental conditions, either as a result of moving northwards into Europe and Asia, or in Africa as a result of major climatic change, the more intelligent, the cleverer ones would have undoubtedly survived better, and so would have had a better chance of passing on their genes. In this sense, one can almost say that intelligence has in fact been selected for. The other question that we must consider is that of language. It is much more difficult to document its development, particularly over long periods of time. But what is certain is that language must have played a crucial role during the rapid expansion of the human behavior patterns that we see in the record. I think the evidence is very clear that language has been fundamental in the evolution of man. But what I find most intriguing is the question of what was the pressure that distinguished our early ancestors from the other mammals? Why is it that we have such a complicated and perfected ability to communicate, whereas other creatures have a much lesser capacity than ourselves? All animals can communicate, but communication is not the same thing as speech. These large mounds, for example, are built by termites. Termites communicate by touch and by using a chemical language. Chemical messages passed from one to another allow them to work together to build these extraordinary structures from material that they excrete. Every termite is programmed to perform its specific task. Each chemical message triggers a particular and unchanging response. There's no flexibility in this language, but it's certainly good enough to allow the termites to work together very efficiently. These are humpbacked whales, and they communicate with eerie and mournful cries. The cries are only used when the whales move into southern waters in the summer to mate and give birth. Apparently, the calls change every year, so it's probably a more flexible language than that of the termites, and must have some recognizable meaning, at least to other whales. The language of hunting carnivores is more complex. These hyenas communicate with each other through sight, smell, and various calls. It's a system that enables them to operate as a group to chase and kill their prey. They clearly don't need speech, in a human sense, to operate efficiently. Even more sophisticated is the language of chimpanzees. They're our closest relatives, so they could provide clues to the kind of communication from which our human language might have developed. Chimps have a variety of calls, many with specific meanings. A cry for danger. Another cry for anger. Chimps are so intelligent and so good at communicating that there were hopes that they could actually be taught to talk.
Can you say what this is?
It didn't work. This chimp, Vicky, was taught for several years, but with little success.
Vicky, say mama. Better. Mama.
Chimps simply don't have the right kind of vocal apparatus to produce the complex sounds of speech.
Say what this is. Papa? That's right.
So a new approach was tried, and it began here in Oklahoma, at a town that was to give its name to perhaps the best-known chimp in the world, Washoe. The study was begun by two professors of psychology, Alan Gardner and his wife Trixie. They raised Washoe in their own home, and they communicated with her not through speech, but by using signs. It's called Ameslan, American Deaf and Dumb Sign Language. No spoken language was used when chimps were present. The researchers wanted to see if they could harness the natural gestural skills of chimpanzees. They taught Washoe first by shaping her hands for each sign. Hands together means more, more. When Washoe got close, like this, she was rewarded by getting more of what she wanted, in this case, a ride in a bowl. Here's her next attempt. More. And again, the reward. As time passed, the sign got a little clearer. More. Soon, she was using the sign not simply for rides, but for more of anything, proof that she had grasped the general concept of the word. Here she wants more food. By now, half-hearted efforts aren't good enough. Only the clear sign, more, gets her what she wants.
Steve, gimme. Ask politely. Come on, please gimme what? You want more? More, gimme. What?
By the time she was 8 years old, Washoe had learnt 180 signs.
Okay.
She was able to carry on conversations with her researchers. One of these was Roger.
What
He's
is
since left the project and gone on to work with other chimpanzees.
Comb me. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yes.
I went to meet Roger and the chimp Moja. I wanted to see just how complex this language was, as it's surely this kind of communicative skill that preceded our ancestors' use of speech.
Right back here. Thank you. Okay, now, what? Why don't you comb Richard? Yes, that's right. Comb his hair.
Oh, dear.
A new style here.
Oh, I must have naughty hair.
Yes, I think she likes it better combed forward and then to the side, Richard.
Oh,
very good.
After the introductions were over, Moja demonstrated some signs.
If she'll do it. Moja, what's this? Once you're through grooming my finger. Okay, that's good. That's good. That won't come off. What's this? What's a bird? That's right. Bird's
That's
made
a
on the
sign
mouth.
for a bird.
Yeah, it's a pinching action on the mouth. Let's see, do this. Spoon. That's right. That's make it a little better. That's from the palm to the mouth. Let's see.
There's a fierce controversy about this work.
You know what this is?
Is it really language?
Yeah, well, you can peek in the box with hat. That's
It's
right.
a hat, yes.
Yes, that's definitely a hat. And what about this? String.
It's been suggested that they're simply naming objects, responding in a stereotyped and conditioned way. But it's much more complex than that.
Some of the more common ways, rather than inventing a brand new sign, what they'll do is take signs that they already know and put them together in a meaningful fashion to express the new idea. For example, Lucy, we did a study on this, and she called a watermelon candy drink. Now, I refer to it as a watermelon. Neither of those two signs were in her vocabulary, so she came up with a candy drink. A radish was rather interesting. She'd had very little experience with it ever, radishes of any type. And it was 4 days old, and she took a bite out of it. She called it food up until that time, and and then called it a cry hurt food, and continued to call it that for the next 8 days of the study. Oh, another thing like the celery and pickle, she referred to as pipe foods, as in a smoking pipe. Also, we found that she would call vegetables food. She'd use that as opposed to fruit. She'd use the fruit sign for fruits. And the other chimps do this readily too. Washoe called a duck a water bird. I called it a duck. She called it a water bird. Another time, Washoe, she was pregnant at this time and had morning sickness and regurgitated some yogurt and raisins. And the student that was working with her, for some reason, I don't know why, but they said, "What is that?" to her. And she called it a berry lotion, which is apropos. On another occasion, I visited her, and she kept saying, "Give me rockberry." And I said, "What do you want?" She finally indicated a box, and I opened up the box, and it was full of Brazil nuts, which is, you know, it makes sense. She knew they were there, and I didn't. So this is very, very common. If they don't have a sign, they'll often recombine. And that shows they understand the symbolic meaning of it.
Experienced chimps like Washoe can take their language a stage further. She created sentences and used syntax in the proper way, something all humans can do. She was shown a baby doll in a cup. The signs for this are baby in my cup. And here's Washoe doing it. Baby in baby in my cup.
Is it really language? I'm convinced it is, but I take a view of language in a very broad sense. Some people focus on just very small parts, grammar and so on, and written language. But language is a social behavior, and it involves turn-taking and initiations and terminations of conversations. And that's what the chimps use it. They use it in their social relations with us. But it should be up here. That's right. Yeah, it's a toy cat, a baby. We've adapted it to them. It's a gestural language rather than a vocal language. You know what that is? Yeah, what is that? Here is something that the chimps can do, and it's just another expression of language. And so it's coming from that same cognitive basis that ours comes from, except ours is a little different, but it's different in degree, not in kind.
Washoe, who is 15 years old, has moved with Roger Fouts to their new premises. And now she has a baby, Lulas.
Okay, come here, Wash. Let's see.
Lulas already has 22 signs, and the important thing is that he's learnt them not from the researchers, but from Washoe herself, just as a human baby learns from its mother. Once again, the similarities to humans are quite startling.
I'm not a biological alchemist. I'm not taking a species and magically changing it into another species. Washoe is a chimp and so is Motion. They'll be that way all their life. But what we are tapping is their mental capacities. The chimpanzee can be used as a model for our early hominid ancestors, for early Homo. And in that sense, it tells us something. At one time we had a common ancestor, so we know, at least I'm convinced, that the capacities for language existed before we separated into our separate ways. It's a different sort of capacity. And so this says that the capacity was there, but how was it different? And there are differences.
The major difference is that we use speech and chimps don't. So the next question is, how did speech become our major means of communication? Speech is controlled by certain structures in the brain, located on the outer cerebral cortex. Wernicke's area pulls out appropriate words from the brain's filing system. The angular gyrus receives signals from our senses of sight, hearing and touch, and it integrates them and selects the appropriate word. Finally, Broca's area, which transmits signals to the lips, tongue and pharynx, and sets speech in motion. Without these three linked areas, we could not speak. So how far back can we trace them? These are casts of the brains of fossils that are millions of years old. They're made by filling a skull with latex rubber. Every brain leaves a faint impression on the inside of the skull, and so you end up with a replica of the outer surface of the brain. Professor Ralph Holloway of Columbia University in New York has been preparing such casts for many years. He studied the brain casts of most human fossil skulls, carefully measuring the minute dips and bumps on the surface of the brain. The important thing is that one of the major speech centers, Broca's area, does in fact protrude as an almost imperceptible bump on the brain's outer surface. Ralph has found this telltale bump on a few of the brain casts of 2-million-year-old skulls. He's naturally cautious about this, but it does suggest that our speech centers could be present very early on. So what caused this? We'll never be certain, but I believe it is to do with the way of life of our ancestors. They were hunter-gatherers, and all hunter-gatherers have to establish a home base, collect food, bring it back and share it. They have to plan ahead, to communicate where the best food is to be found. It's a far more complex lifestyle than the chimps, and it would demand a more complex and flexible means of communication. So there would be strong and constant selection pressures for the development of speech. That could explain the need, but what about the mechanism? One fascinating idea is that our vocal apparatus, lips, tongue, pharynx and so on, evolved because of our flexible hands and our use of gestures.
I think that it went something like this. We were once quadrupedal, like the chimp. We became bipedal. That freed the hands. The hands, of course, would be used for carrying infants and tools, but also they would have a lot of free time on their hands, so to speak. And this free time would be put to use to something that's very adaptive. My guess is that you would get a sign language in terms of the gestural origin of language, and when that increased, the signs would become more specific. Now at that point, I think, what happened was that you got more fine, precision, discrete, such as stop, stop, stop. That facilitated the tongue moving in terms of motor movements of the tongue, because for the tongue to produce vocal speech, all it's doing is stopping at about 50 different spots around the mouth. Stop, stop, stop. And sign language is doing the same thing. Drink, listen, hat, and so on.
So Roger Fouts believes that as our ancestors developed a more flexible hand and a greater use of gestures, that quite literally loosened the tongue and enabled them to speak. And if you think that's all a bit far-fetched, there really is a surprising link.
The hands and the tongue seem to be connected. In the I've done, the earliest reference I found to this connection is Charles Darwin in his book on the expression of emotions in man and animals. He points out that English schoolboys just learning to write, he noted the fantastic, once again they're using precision, grip, fine precision, specific movement, and when they start writing, he knew that the tongue would come out and go into these contortions, and most of us have experienced that when we do something we're not familiar with that requires a very fine precision grip, like threading a needle. Watch somebody thread a needle when they pull it out and they go, and the tongue is coming out as the precision grip is moving toward the target. These are both motor. They're controlled by an area in the brain called the basal ganglia, and that's for fine sensory motor coordinations, as you'd find in precision grips hands and also tongue movement. And that, by the way, is where you get the largest amount of gray matter in the brain.
The one archaeological clue we have to this increased precision comes from the progress of stone tool making. Two million years ago, the earliest stone tools were made by simply striking a few flakes from a cobble. No great precision was needed. The brain didn't have to work very hard to create these tools. Speech at that stage was certainly equally rudimentary. By 1 million years ago, the toolmaker was attempting more complex shapes and was working more purposefully. A hand axe like this needs to be worked out in advance, rather like a sculptor has to envisage the final shape of his statue inside the rough stone before he starts. Increasing order is being imposed on the stone, and this paralleled the way that speech and words came to impose shape on our thoughts and on the objects around us. By about 40,000 years ago, stone is being worked with increasing precision to produce long, thin blades of predetermined size and shape. These are then further treated with great care to produce specialist tools in a much greater range and variety than ever before. I see a connection between the more flexible use of the hands, the more flexible use of stone, and the more flexible use of language. They're all linked through a developing brain. As the pattern and order in the tools becomes more complex, it mirrors an increasingly complex pattern in the spoken word. I think one of our greatest frustrations is that we'll never know when language began, nor will we ever know what the early structure of language was like. I do believe, however, that language goes back a very long time indeed, probably to the times of Homo erectus. It's my view that a species as successful as erectus, a species that moved over many parts of the world, that developed very sophisticated technology and culture, must have had language. With language, man is able to do many things that other animals cannot even attempt. We can pass on information, we can pass on knowledge, we can pass on skills, we can teach others of our experiences, we can have wise men's counsels, we can do so many things that are so uniquely human. It's my belief that with the beginning of language and with the development of it as an attribute of mankind, our evolution changed gear, if you like. We moved from having a purely biological evolution to one that was much more cultural. And indeed, it's my view that with language, the whole emphasis of human development changed.